The silver tray tilts, and the world tilts with it. Crystal kisses marble, shatters, and the grand hall inhales as if the mansion itself is shocked. Mr. Graves's voice lashes out, precise, polished, cruel. "On your knees, girl. Clean what you've ruined." Clara blinks fast, but a tear escapes, tracing the edge of her cheek like a confession. From the staircase, a man in a black suit stops, eyes narrowing, and the room freezes as he says, "That's my daughter." If that opening hit you in the chest, take a second to breathe with me. I'm telling this story for anyone who's ever swallowed tears in a room full of strangers. If you want more moments like this, subscribe to the channel and tap the like button. It helps a ton. And tell me in the comments, what would you have done if you were Clara in that hall? Now, let me rewind, because nights like this are sewn with threads you can't see at first glance. That morning, the mansion woke up proud, as if it had been born wearing a tuxedo. Sunlight crawled across polished banisters and portraits that never blinked. Clara pressed the apron strings tight around her waist and whispered, "Steady." She was good at disappearing, moving like a quiet thought, but Mr. Graves always found her the way hawks find field mice. He studied the world through a lens of rank and ritual, and Clara never fit the frame. "Lift your chin," he'd say. "A bowed head invites pity, and you haven't earned even that." She learned the labyrinth of his rules. The edge of the silver should face the guest. The glass should shine like a promise. Her hands remembered, even when her heart forgot. Still, he could smell fear as surely as polish. By noon, the kitchen pulsed with preparations for the evening's gala. Copper pots sang, knives kept time, and the pastry chef swore in French under his breath. Clara. Arranged crystal flutes on velvet, the rims as thin as secrets. Eliza brushed by, slipping a sugar cube into Clara's palm like a charm. "For courage," she whispered, and it sweetened Clara's tongue, if not her day. An invitation list lay on the counter like a verdict. Judges, donors, old money with new appetites. At the very top, Richard Alcott, rumoured to be arriving after years abroad. "Try not to stare," Graves murmured, smoothing the list with a satisfied thumb. "He notices everything." Clara said nothing. Noticing had never saved her before. But the name felt heavy, like a key she didn't know she carried. Dusk came dressed in gold. The chandeliers woke, and the string quartet tuned until the air tasted of resin and polish. Clara moved through the hall with the tray, counting steps the way some people count prayers. Her reflection followed in the marble, small, obedient, unremarkable. Graves hovered close enough to steal her air, close enough to speak without moving his lips. "Don't embarrass the house." A guest brushed her shoulder, and one glass chimed against another, a tiny bell of doom. Graves's hand shot out, too late to steady the tray, perfectly timed to blame her. "Clumsy!" he hissed, the word sharp enough to draw blood. She knelt, fingers trembling, collecting glittering shards that bit like winter. The quartet faltered, then stopped, as if the music didn't dare play over someone else's humiliation. And then footsteps, measured, unhurried, the kind that always belonged to the owner of the room. Clara didn't look up. Shame has its own gravity. Graves straightened, arranging dignity on his face like a fresh boutonniere. The man from the staircase drew nearer, the murmurs thinning as though words were afraid to be overheard. "Enough," he said softly, and the syllables turned the air. Clara lifted her eyes and met a gaze she didn't know, but somehow recognized. It landed with the weight of a memory her bones remembered before her mind did. He stared at the tear on her cheek, at the shape of her mouth, at the stubborn lift of her chin despite everything. Something old and broken stirred in him, like a clock restarting. "That's my daughter," he said, and the mansion seemed to take a step back. Graves' face twitched, just enough to betray the panic sprinting behind his eyes. Guests froze between curiosity and etiquette, holding their breaths like contraband. Eliza's hand flew to her mouth, and the quartet's bows hovered in mid-air. Clara didn't stand. The world had shifted too quickly for her legs to believe it. Names are doors, and that one swung open with a thunderclap. Later, people would swear they felt the floor move. They would say the chandeliers dimmed and then brightened, that the portraits smirked, that the house itself chose a side. But right then, all Clara felt was a pulse in her palm, the sting of glass and the sudden impossible warmth of being seen. She didn't know whether to run or to breathe, and somewhere, under the music that wasn't playing, the past turned its key in a hidden lock. The party ended in whispers, like a storm retreating, but leaving the sky bruised. Servants gathered the broken glass in silence, their eyes avoiding Clara as if her very presence carried danger. Mr. Graves vanished into the darkness of the study, his pride collapsing behind the door. Clara stood frozen in the empty hall, her reflection scattered across the marble in 1,000 glittering fragments. For the first time, the mansion felt alive, and it was watching her. Richard Alcott dismissed the guests with a voice that sounded older than he was. Behind his composure, confusion churned like thunder. How could his child have been serving under his own roof, unseen, unnamed, unloved, the scent of smoke? And spilled wine hung in the air as he walked away, leaving only the echo of his words. "That's my daughter." They rang in Clara's head until they became both blessing and curse. Eliza found her still kneeling, trembling hands clinging to the last unbroken glass. "You should rest," she whispered, but Clara shook her head. "Rest from what?" she said, her voice small, almost breaking. "From being seen or from being invisible?" Eliza didn't answer. Some questions have no safe truth. Together, they carried the fragments to the servants' quarters, each step heavier than the last. That night, the mansion swallowed its own noise. The laughter was gone, replaced by an uneasy hush. In the servants' wing, Clara sat on her narrow bed, the candlelight trembling as if afraid of the dark. She pressed her palms to her eyes, trying to erase the image of the man who had called her daughter. Outside, the wind scraped against the windows like fingers asking to be let in. In another part of the house, Richard sat alone in his study, the fireplace burning too hot. On his desk lay an old photo, his late wife holding a baby wrapped in lace. His hands trembled as he traced the outline of the child's face, a face that now belonged to the maid he had just humiliated without knowing. Guilt crawled up his spine like a slow fever. "Forgive me," he whispered. To whom, he wasn't sure. Sometimes stories like this remind us that truth hides in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to be seen. If you've ever discovered something that changed how you saw someone forever, leave a comment below. I'd love to know what moment in your life felt like this one for Clara. And if you're feeling the ache of this story, don't forget to subscribe. It helps keep these stories alive, just like the memories in this house. Mr. Graves stood before the mirror in the wine cellar, his reflection flickering in the candle's flame. His face was pale, his jaw tight. "He wasn't supposed to find out," he muttered, gripping the edge of the counter. The mirror offered no comfort, only the echo of his guilt. He poured himself a drink, but the liquor didn't steady him. "It's all her fault," he whispered, though the tremor in his voice betrayed the lie. Clara couldn't sleep. Every creak of the mansion felt like a whisper calling her name. She wandered through the corridors barefoot, her white apron ghost-like against the dark wood. When she reached the staircase, she looked up at the chandelier, where the light first fell on her shame. It sparkled now as if mocking her. "Why me?" she murmured, her voice trembling. "What did I ever do to deserve this truth?" In the library, Richard heard the faint sound of her voice. He followed it, stopping halfway down the stairs. There she was, small, broken and glowing with something he couldn't define. "Clara," he said softly, and she turned. Her eyes were red but fierce. For a long moment neither spoke. Words would only make the distance between them real. Silence, for now, was safer. When dawn came, the mansion stood still, caught between night and morning, between lies and light. The servants avoided Clara's gaze, unsure whether to bow or turn away. Mr. Graves watched from the hallway, his hands clasped behind his back, the mask of obedience slipping from his face. Clara felt the weight of every stare, every unspoken question. She didn't yet know it, but the shadows of that house were just beginning to move. Morning light crawled across the study, touching dust that had slept for years. Richard sat behind the desk, the night still clinging to his shoulders. The fire from the evening before had burned out, leaving behind a scent of smoke and regret. His fingers brushed against a drawer that hadn't been opened since his wife's death. Inside, he found an envelope sealed with wax, his late wife's initials pressed into the red. His pulse stuttered. He broke the seal, and the paper sighed as if it had been waiting to speak. The handwriting was elegant, trembling at the edges of each word. "Richard, by the time you read this, the truth will have found its own way home." He read the sentence again and again, until it no longer felt like ink. It felt like blood. The letter spoke of shame, of a secret that had to be hidden to protect the Alcott name. At the end, 3 words that drained the color from his face: "She is alive." In the servants' quarters, Clara cleaned the same tray that had shattered her dignity the night before. The bruises on her knees burned, but the silence hurt worse. Eliza entered quietly, placing a steaming cup beside her. "He hasn't left his study," she said. "Not since the guests went home." Clara didn't answer. She was still trapped in the echo of that single sentence. "That's my daughter." The word haunted her, both a curse and a comfort. Richard held the letter tighter, his knuckles white. He imagined his wife writing it, her hand shaking, her tears staining the paper. He remembered her final days, her silence that he mistook for peace. Now he saw it for what it was: guilt. The truth was never buried. It had simply been waiting for him to look deep enough. He sank back in the chair, the sound of his own heartbeat loud in the hollow room. "Mr. Graves entered without knocking, his hands folded neatly in front of him. "You shouldn't go through her things, sir," he said, his tone low, respectful, but laced with something darker. Richard looked up, eyes red. "You knew," he said. The butler froze. The pause that followed was longer than honesty should allow. "I did what was necessary," Graves murmured, though the guilt trembled in his jaw. Richard stood, his anger burning not with fire but with grief. "You hid my child from me." The words fell heavy, not shouted but broken. Graves bowed his head, his mask of control cracking. "I followed orders," he whispered. "She wanted the scandal buried. I only protected what was left of her dignity." The truth turned sour in Richard's mouth. "And what about my daughter's dignity?" he asked, voice trembling. Graves had no answer. In the hallway, Clara listened, the words seeping through the half-open door. Each revelation struck her like a blow. The Butler mother had obeyed. Her father had looked away. Everyone she trusted had built the same lie, layer by layer, until she was trapped inside it. The world she thought she knew was gone. What remained was only the echo of betrayal. She stumbled back into the servants' corridor, breath uneven, tears rising fast. Eliza reached for her, but Clara stepped away. "He knew," she whispered. "They all knew." Her hands trembled so hard, the cup she held shattered against the floor. This time, she didn't kneel to clean the pieces. She simply stared at them, realizing how much a broken thing could still reflect light. Upstairs, Richard folded the letter and pressed it to his chest. "I will fix this," he promised the silence. But the mansion seemed to breathe in reply, a slow exhale that sounded like warning. He didn't yet understand that the letter was not an ending. It was an opening, a door to truths he wasn't ready to face, and guilt that would demand its due before dawn. The wine cellar was cold, heavy with the scent of oak and regret. Mr. Graves sat alone at the long wooden table, a single candle flickering beside him. His hands, always so steady, trembled as he poured another drink. The flame reflected in the dark surface of the wine, a red ghost staring back. "I did what was right," he muttered. "I did what had to be done." But even the walls didn't believe him anymore. Every bottle on the shelf seemed to whisper his sins. He had spent years perfecting silence, mastering the art of discretion, convincing himself that loyalty was virtue. But Clara's tears had shattered that illusion. Her eyes, the same eyes as the woman he once loved, followed him wherever he turned. He pressed his palms to his face, but memories bled through his fingers. "Forgive me," he whispered, though forgiveness was not his to claim. Upstairs, Clara moved through the corridors like a ghost, haunting her own story. Every corner of the mansion seemed to hum with secrets she hadn't asked to inherit. She heard muffled footsteps, the echo of her father's pacing, the heavy stillness of guilt settling in every room. The portrait of her mother stared down from the wall, both judge and memory. Clara touched the frame, whispering, "Did you love me even after you sent me away?" Richard stood in front of the same portrait, miles away in thought. He could almost hear his wife's voice, soft and trembling. "You'll thank me one day for what I've done." But there was no gratitude left in him, only loss. The letter still burned in his pocket, a brand of truth he could no longer hide from. "You destroyed her," he murmured, and the silence replied, "So did you." Sometimes the hardest thing to admit is that everyone in a tragedy thinks they're the hero. If you're still here, breathing this story with me, take a second to reflect. Have you ever hurt someone thinking you were protecting them? Tell me in the comments. I read every word. And if you want to see whether Richard and Clara will heal or fall apart, subscribe and stay close. This mansion hasn't told all its truths yet. The door to the wine cellar creaked open. Richard's shadow stretched across the stone floor. Graves didn't look up at first. Cowards rarely do. "I know," Richard said quietly. The butler froze. "You knew she was alive." Graves's glass slipped from his hand, shattering on the floor, the echo cutting through the damp air. "I was trying to protect her," he said, but his voice cracked on the word protect. "From me?" Richard's tone was almost gentle, and that made it worse. "From her own father?" Graves rose slowly, his face pale, his posture collapsing under the weight of old lies. "You don't understand," he rasped. "She would have been ruined. Your name, your fortune, everything." Richard stepped closer. Burning eyes. "You ruined her anyway," he said, his voice breaking for the first time. The silence between them was thick, raw, and final. Graves' hand shook as he reached for the table, searching for a glass that wasn't there. "I loved her mother," he whispered, and Richard flinched as if struck. The confession hung in the air, heavy and human. For a second, neither man breathed. The truth didn't absolve him, it exposed him. And that was worse. From the hallway, Clara heard everything. "I loved her mother," cut through her like a blade dipped in memory. Her heart raced as she stepped back, her hand clutching the banister. Her mother, the butler, the father who never knew, every secret colliding inside her chest. The world tilted again, just like the tray that started it all. She turned and ran, the sound of her footsteps echoing through the sleeping house. Rain began to fall outside, soft at first, then harder, until the windows trembled with it. Richard followed her through the corridor, calling her name, his voice breaking with fear. "Clara!" But she didn't stop. The door burst open, and the night swallowed her whole. In the distance, lightning painted the sky white. For the first time, Richard understood, some storms aren't weather, they're consequence. The storm outside roared like a confession too loud to contain. Clara ran through the corridors, her breath short, her heart a desperate drumbeat. The candle in her hand trembled, spilling wax like tears across the floor. She didn't know where she was going, only that she needed distance from the voices that had rewritten her past. When she stopped, it was in the one room that still held the ghost of love, the portrait gallery. Moonlight poured through tall windows, silvering the rows of painted faces. Her mother's portrait hung in the center, serene and untouchable, framed in gold that had outlasted truth. Clara moved closer, her fingers brushing the canvas as if it might breathe. "You lied to him," she whispered. "You lied to me." The eyes in the portrait glowed softly in the candlelight, sad, forgiving, and unbearably alive. Behind her, footsteps approached, heavy but uncertain. Richard stopped at the threshold, his reflection overlapping with hers in the glass that protected the painting. "I looked at her every day," he said quietly, "and still never saw you." Clara turned, eyes red but steady. "You weren't looking for me," she replied. "You were looking for the version of yourself that could forget." He took a step closer, the weight of years folding his shoulders. "Your mother thought she was protecting you," he said. "She thought she was saving you from the burden of our name." Clara's laughter broke like glass, soft, sharp, impossible to stop. "And in saving me," she said, "you both taught me what it means to be unwanted." Her voice trembled, but her eyes didn't flinch. Sometimes the hardest truths don't come in anger, but in silence, the kind that echoes long after the words fade. If you've ever stood between love and resentment, between what you lost and what you can't forgive, leave a comment below. I want to know how you made peace with your ghosts, and don't forget to subscribe. This story's just beginning to open its wounds, and I'd hate for you to look away before the healing starts. Richard moved closer until the candlelight caught his face, revealing the ruin of regret. "I was blind," he said, "too proud to see what I'd lost." Clara looked up at her mother's painted face again. "She's still between us," she murmured. "Even now." Richard nodded. "Then let her watch," he said softly. "Let her see us try." The words were fragile, but they carried something real. Hope, maybe, or desperation pretending to be it. The storm flashed white through the windows, throwing their shadows across the floor. For a heartbeat, Clara saw the reflection of her family as it could have been. Her father beside her, her mother smiling from the frame. It hurt too much to look and too much to turn away. "Do you really believe you can fix this?" she asked. "No," he said, "but I have to try." The candle flickered, almost out. "Why me?" she asked suddenly. "Why now?" Richard's answer came slow, as if it cost him breath. "Because when I saw you cry, I saw her again, and for the first time, I wanted to be the man I should have been." His voice cracked, the words half a sob. "Let me start there, if nowhere else." Clara didn't answer, but her silence wasn't rejection. It was survival learning to trust. Thunder shook the windows, and the portrait shuddered on its hook. For a moment, it looked as though the painted woman might step out and gather them both into her arms. Clara reached for the frame, steadying it. "You've caused enough chaos for one lifetime," she whispered to her mother's ghost. Richard smiled faintly, the first real smile he'd shown her. "Then maybe this time," he said. We finish the story differently. As dawn crept through the gallery, the storm softened into rain. Father and daughter stood in silence, two broken reflections of the same mistake, finally facing it together. Outside, the world was clean again, but inside, the air still smelled of smoke, salt, and memory. The portrait gleamed in the new light, neither accusing nor forgiving, just watching. And for the first time, Clara didn't look away. By morning, the rain had rinsed the world, but not the mansion. Its walls still held the storm, soaked in silence. Clara walked through the servants' corridors with a new kind of gaze upon her. Eyes that used to look through her now burned holes in her back. Every whisper seemed to wear her name. She wasn't invisible anymore, but she wished she still were. At breakfast, the staff spoke in low tones that stopped whenever she entered the room. Silver clinked against porcelain like nervous laughter. Eliza sat beside her, loyal but tense, her hand tightening around her cup. "They don't know what to believe," she murmured. "They've served lies too long to trust the truth." Clara nodded, pretending not to care, but her pulse betrayed her calm. Her new name felt heavier than the uniform she still wore. "Mr. Graves observed from the end of the table, his authority now ghost-like, visible but fading. He saw how the servants avoided his gaze, how the hierarchy he'd ruled with fear began to crumble. Power was a delicate wine, and his had turned sour overnight. "Remember your place," he warned one maid sharply, but the tremor in his voice revealed the truth. Even he no longer believed he had one. Later that day, Clara polished the silver banister she used to scrub as punishment. Now her reflection looked back at her differently, still trembling, still uncertain, but stronger. Eliza approached quietly, slipping her a folded note. "He's watching you," she whispered. "Be careful." Clara opened the note later, behind the laundry room door. It wasn't a message of comfort. It was a warning written in uneven ink. The truth is dangerous when it belongs to a servant. The mansion was alive with whispers that day, some cruel, some curious. Clara felt them crawl along the walls, into the rooms, through the seams of her thoughts. She began to understand that freedom comes with a different kind of cage, expectation. Everyone wanted her to act like a lady, but still serve like a maid. And in between those roles, she didn't know who she was meant to be. If you've ever felt caught between who you were and who you're supposed to become, you'll understand Clara's silence here. Tell me in the comments, what do you do when the world decides to see you differently, but you still feel the same inside? And if you want to stay by her side through the whispers and the truth that's coming, subscribe now. The next secret might change everything. By evening, the servants' gossip turned venomous. "She's faking," one of them hissed. "No one goes from servant to heiress overnight." "Maybe she bewitched him," another added. Mr. Graves stood nearby, letting the rumors breed, poison disguised as conversation. Every lie made him feel less guilty, as if the crowd's cruelty could share his sin. The mansion's heart grew colder by the hour. In the kitchen, Clara overheard the laughter, each sound a blade drawn slowly across her skin. Eliza slammed a pot down, silencing the room. "She's done nothing wrong," she snapped, but even her loyalty trembled. Clara stepped forward, her voice low but clear. "Let them speak. Truth doesn't need their approval." The room went still. Her strength scared them more than her weakness ever had. When night fell, Clara escaped to the garden for air. The rain had left the roses heavy with water, their petals bruised but beautiful. She traced one with her fingertip, whispering, "They still bloom after the storm." For the first time she believed it. Behind her, a window creaked open. Mr. Graves's shadow watching from above, his eyes two small embers of regret. "She's her mother's daughter," he murmured, voice shaking. Inside, the mansion whispered her name again, but this time it sounded different. Not mockery, not pity, something closer to awe, or maybe fear. Clara lifted her chin toward the light in the upper windows, knowing he was there. "Keep watching," she said softly. "You'll see what you created." And when the wind rose again, carrying the faint echoes of her mother's laughter, the house finally sounded alive. The next morning began with mist crawling over the garden like a secret trying to hide itself. Clara couldn't sleep. The whispers still echoed in her ears, but one question beat louder than all of them. Why did they lie? Eliza found her in the hallway, clutching a set of keys. "The archives," she whispered. "If there's proof of who you are, it's there." Fear flickered behind her eyes, but determination burned brighter. Clara nodded. "Then we find it." They moved through the mansion's underbelly, past locked doors, and the smell of old paper and dust. The air was heavy with time. Cobwebs clung to the corners like forgotten promises. Eliza lit a small oil lamp, its glow trembling against shelves of ledgers and family records. "Everything the Alcotts ever hid," she murmured. "They hid here." Clara's hands shook as she reached for a stack of boxes labeled personal correspondence. Inside the third box was a bundle of letters tied with ribbon faded to grey. Beneath it, something else. A small leather envelope, its clasp rusted, its edges torn. Clara opened it slowly, her breath catching when she saw the photograph, a baby wrapped in lace, sleeping in a woman's arms. The woman's face, familiar, heartbreakingly so. Clara's mother, and on the back, in neat handwriting, "For Richard, the day she was born." The lamplight flickered as the truth sank in. Clara pressed the photo to her chest, the edges cutting her palm. "It's me," she whispered, her voice breaking. "It's really me." Eliza smiled
"Now
through
you
tears.
have
"Proof," she said softly, but before she could say more, a sound broke through the stillness, a door creaking open, footsteps, slow, deliberate. Mr. Graves's shadow filled the doorway. He looked like he'd aged 10 years overnight. His expression wasn't anger, it was fear. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice trembling. "You don't understand what you're doing." Clara straightened, clutching the photograph. "I understand enough," she replied. "You all buried me once. I won't let you do it again." Graves took a step forward, eyes dark. "You think truth saves people? It destroys them. Sometimes the truth really does burn more than lies ever could. But tell me, if you were Clara, would you still want to know everything, even if it broke your heart? Leave your answer in the comments. I read them all. And if this story has you holding your breath like I am while writing it, subscribe now. The fire's about to start, and you won't want to miss what it burns. Eliza moved between them, her courage surprising even herself. "She has a right to know," she said. Graves's jaw tightened. "You're meddling with things you don't understand, girl." Clara's voice rose, steady and sharp. "I understand betrayal. I understand fear. And I understand that my mother loved me enough to leave proof." She lifted the photo into the lamplight. "This is the truth you couldn't destroy." For a moment something human flickered in Graves's eyes. Pain, regret, maybe even love. "She trusted me," he said quietly. "Your mother, she made me promise to protect you." Clara's breath caught. "By lying?" He nodded slowly. "By keeping you far from him. I failed her the moment you came back." His shoulders slumped under the weight of years of silence. The truth had finally found him, and it was merciless. He reached for the photo, but Clara stepped back. "No more secrets," she said. "Not from me." Her voice echoed through the archive room, filling every dusty corner. Graves lowered his hand, defeated. "Then may God forgive me," he whispered. because the truth won't." And with that, he turned and left, the sound of his footsteps heavy with guilt and finality. Clara stood frozen, the photograph trembling between her fingers. Eliza placed a hand on her shoulder. "You did it," she said softly. "You found it." But Clara didn't smile. The truth didn't feel like victory. It felt like a door opening to a fire. She looked down at her mother's face one last time. "Then it's time," she whispered, "for everyone else to see it too." As they left the archive, the lamp burned low, its flame guttering in the still air. Behind them, shadows swayed along the walls, whispering of things not yet confessed. Outside, thunder rumbled faintly again, as if the storm had been waiting for this moment. In her hands, the photograph felt warm, alive almost, proof of love, proof of lies. Proof that the past never really dies. It only hides until you find it. Night returned to the mansion like a thief, quiet and deliberate. Clara couldn't sleep. The photograph pulsed in her pocket like a heartbeat. Down the hall, Richard's study still glowed faintly under the door, a light that never went out since the truth surfaced. She thought of knocking, of showing him the picture, but something in her chest said not yet. Some truths needed air before they could burn. And tonight, the house itself seemed to be holding its breath. Richard sat by the fireplace, staring into flames that refused to die. The letter from his wife lay open on the desk beside a decanter of brandy, half empty. His hands trembled as he lifted the glass, seeing his reflection ripple in the amber. "How many lives did I ruin trying to protect one name?" he whispered. The fire popped, as if answering him, sending a spark onto the rug. He didn't notice, not yet. In the servants' quarters, Mr. Graves sat awake, his candle burned to a stump. His guilt had grown heavier than the house itself. Every creak in the wood sounded like a voice from the past. "You promised her," he told his reflection in the window. "You promised to protect the girl." His eyes drifted toward the study's faint glow. He stood suddenly, heart pounding with a decision too late to matter. Smoke reached Clara's nose before her fear did. She rose from bed, clutching the photograph. The air tasted wrong, thick, metallic, alive. "Eliza!" she cried, but the servant was already running toward her. "It's the study!" Eliza gasped. "It's burning!" The two ran through the corridor, nightgowns brushing against the walls as the scent of fire swelled. Heat bled through the air like anger. Richard was still inside when Clara arrived. Flames danced along the curtains, crawling up the walls as if the room had been waiting for this moment of confession. "Father!" she shouted, voice raw. He turned, eyes wild with disbelief. "Go back!" he yelled, but she didn't. She ran in, covering her mouth, the photograph pressed to her chest. The fire's roar swallowed his protests whole. Sometimes what destroys us is the very thing that forces the truth into the open. If you've ever held on to something until it almost burned you alive, just because letting go felt harder, tell me in the comments. I want to know. And if you're here, heart racing with Clara's, subscribe now. You won't believe what this fire will reveal when the smoke clears. Clara threw a blanket over the desk, smothering flames that licked at the old papers. Richard rushed to her side, pulling her back. "You'll get yourself killed," he shouted. "Then at least it'll mean something," she cried, tears mixing with ash. The photograph fell to the floor, catching light but not flame. When he saw it, his wife, his baby, he froze. The world narrowed to that single piece of truth surviving the fire. Graves burst into the room, coughing, eyes watering. "Get her out!" he barked. He tore the curtains down, beating the flames with shaking arms. For a second, it looked like he might redeem himself, until a beam above cracked with a sound like thunder. Richard pushed Clara toward the door, shouting her name as the ceiling gave way. The fire roared, alive and hungry. They stumbled into the hall as smoke poured from the study. Servants screamed, rushing with buckets and blankets. Graves stood silhouetted against the inferno, his face bathed in red light. "Save the portrait!" he shouted, disappearing into the smoke. Clara reached out, but the heat shoved her back. The fire consumed everything, letters, records, secrets, until all that was left was light and loss. Hours later, dawn crept through the ashes. The study was gone, only blackened walls and melted glass. Richard stood among the ruins, soot streaking his face. Clara found the photograph half-burned on the floor, the baby's face still intact, the mother's gone. "She's gone again," she whispered. Richard placed a trembling hand on her shoulder. "No," he said softly. "Now she's finally here." Outside, the rain returned, falling like forgiveness that came too late. The fire had taken the lies, the letters, the proof, but not the truth. That still lived, fragile and defiant, in Clara's hand. The mansion smelled of something else, and endings, a faint trace of renewal, like soil after a storm. The fire hadn't just destroyed, it had cleared the way for what was coming next. The mansion tried to forget the fire, the staff polished, painted, replaced, but the scent of smoke lingered like memory. Richard insisted on hosting a dinner to restore order, though no one felt ready to dine on ashes. The chandelier had been cleaned, the curtains replaced, yet the air still hummed with what was lost. Clara stood at the top of the stairs in a new dress that didn't feel like hers. Every thread whispered, "You don't belong." Downstairs, servants arranged the table with trembling hands. The silver gleamed, the wine shimmered, and Mr. Graves moved through it all like a ghost, desperate to appear solid. His jacket was pressed, his posture perfect, but his eyes were hollow. He poured wine for the guests, as if baptizing them in denial. Clara's reflection glimmered in every goblet, one truth multiplied, fragile and clear. When Richard entered the hall, all conversation died. The guests rose politely, their curiosity sharper than their smiles. "To new beginnings," he said, lifting his glass. Clara's hand tightened around her napkin. The word beginning sounded wrong. How could anything begin where so much had burned? Across the table, Mr. Graves avoided her gaze, but guilt has a scent stronger than smoke. Dinner began in uneasy rhythm, forks against china, laughter rehearsed too loudly, eyes darting where they shouldn't. Clara felt every stare slide across her like a test she didn't know the answers to. Beside her, Eliza served quietly, watching Graves with a look that could cut glass. The air was heavy, charged with unspoken words. Richard raised his glass again, his face calm but pale. "Before we eat," he said, "there's something you all deserve to know." He turned toward Clara, and the room leaned in. "This young woman," he began, "is not merely a member of my staff, she is my daughter." The words rippled through the table like thunder rolling across crystal. A few gasped, others exchanged looks too polite to be honest. Clara's heart pounded so hard it hurt. Graves froze mid-motion, the bottle trembling in his hand. Then, as if echoing that first night, a single glass slipped from his grip and shattered on the floor. Sometimes, the moment you fear most is the one that finally sets you free. Tell me in the comments, would you rather live with a lie that keeps peace or a truth that breaks everything? I read every story you share. And if your heart's beating as fast as Clara's right now, subscribe, because what happens after this dinner will change every life in this room. The silence that followed was unbearable. Graves bent to pick up the shards, but his hand shook so violently that blood bloomed where glass met skin. "That's enough," Richard said firmly. "There's no need for pretense anymore." Graves looked up slowly, eyes wide with a desperate kind of defiance. "No need for pretense," he echoed, voice cracking. "Then tell them all the truth, sir." The room inhaled sharply. Richard stiffened, his control slipping. "Not now," he warned. But Graves stood, his napkin falling to the floor like a flag of surrender. "You think confessing her name cleans your conscience?" he said, voice trembling with rage and sorrow. "You buried her once, just like her mother, and now you want applause for digging her up?" His words struck harder than any slap could. Clara rose from her seat, her pulse roaring in her ears. "Stop," she whispered, but no one listened. The guests watched, fascinated and horrified, like witnesses to a beautiful accident. "You don't get to speak for her," Richard hissed, stepping closer. "And you don't get to rewrite history," Graves spat back. For the first time, pride and guilt looked identical. The chandelier trembled above, as if the mansion itself couldn't bear to hear. Eliza reached for Clara's hand under the table, grounding her in the chaos. "He's unraveling," she whispered. Clara nodded, but her own body felt like glass, thin, sharp, ready to break. Graves's voice softened suddenly, almost breaking. "I loved her mother," he said, the confession spilling out like wine. "And I failed them both." No one moved. The truth had finally found its audience. When the last candle flickered out, no one clapped, no one spoke. The dinner that was meant to restore order had instead served justice on porcelain plates. Graves stood shaking, his face wet with tears he didn't bother to hide. Richard turned away, broken and breathless. Clara, caught between them, whispered the only words that made sense. "The truth doesn't belong to you. It belongs to her." And the night didn't end when the candles died. The guests lingered in stunned silence, their reflections caught in the dark mirrors like ghosts unwilling to leave. Clara stood between her father and the man who had ruined her life, both of them trembling under the weight of what they'd hidden. The air in the dining hall was thick with truth, too much of it, too fast. No one dared move, as if motion itself might shatter what was left of their world. Mr. Graves's voice was hoarse, raw from restraint. "You want the truth?" he asked, looking not at Richard but at Clara. "Then hear it all." He stepped forward, the candlelight painting his face in broken strokes. "Your mother begged me to hide you," he said. "Not because she didn't love you, but because she was afraid of what his pride would do to you." His words cut through the air like a confession at the edge of death. Richard's hands clenched at his sides. "That's not true," he said, but the tremor in his voice betrayed him. "You would have sent her away yourself," Graves interrupted, his tone collapsing. "You already sent her mother into silence. You couldn't bear another scandal staining your name." His eyes glistened, not with anger now, but with regret. "I lied for her, I lied for you, and I lost everything for it." Clara's breath caught. The world seemed to tilt again, that same dizzying tilt from the night of the broken glass. "You both lied," she whispered, tears threatening to spill. "You both stole my life." Her father took a step forward, reaching for her, but she pulled away. "Don't," she said softly. "Every time you try to protect me, someone burns." The fire in her words hurt more than the one that destroyed his study. Sometimes the truth doesn't free us, it just shows us the shape of our chains. Tell me in the comments, have you ever heard something you thought you wanted to know and wished you could unhear it? And if you're here, walking through the ruins of this family with me, subscribe. There's more to come, because not every confession ends in forgiveness. Graves sank into a chair, exhausted, shaking his head. "I wanted to be better than him," he muttered, nodding toward Richard. "But I became worse. I thought serving the family meant saving it." His laughter cracked, hollow and painful. "All I did was feed its rot." Richard stared at him, eyes glassy with rage and sorrow. "You had no right," he whispered. "You took my child from me, and you made me your monster," Graves replied. Eliza stood frozen near the doorway, her apron stained with spilled wine and fear. She wanted to run, to hide, but she couldn't move. The room felt sacred in its devastation. Clara looked at both men, the father who lost her, the servant who hid her, and saw not power but weakness, two men bound by guilt pretending it was love. "I don't want apologies," she said. "I want peace." Neither man could promise it. The silence that followed was heavy enough to bow the chandeliers. Richard finally spoke, his voice breaking in half. "You're fired," he told Graves quietly. "Leave this house." The butler nodded, too broken to argue. But as he turned to go, Clara's voice stopped him. "No," she said. "You don't get to vanish like a ghost. You'll live with what you've done. Both of you will." Her words carried more weight than punishment ever could. Graves looked at her, tears slipping through the cracks of his composure. "I only did what I thought was right," he whispered. "You always say that," Clara said, her tone soft but merciless. "So did my mother. So does he. Maybe right just means what hurts the least." She stepped past him, her hand brushing the table where the glass had shattered earlier. It was gone, but the sound still lived in her ears. Richard reached for her once more, but she was already walking away. The hem of her dress whispered across the marble, the final sound in a room full of ghosts. Graves sank to his knees, the image of a man undone by his own loyalty. Richard watched his daughter disappear up the stairs, the echo of her footsteps hammering what was left of his heart. And somewhere in the quiet aftermath, the house itself seemed to whisper, "Confession is never the end. It's the beginning of consequence." Morning came slowly, as if the sun itself hesitated to rise over what remained of the Elcott mansion. Clara stood at her window, the sky grey and endless. Below, the servants moved quietly, cleaning the remnants of the night before. Nothing looked broken, yet everything was. Her suitcase lay open on the bed, half filled, half forbidden. Leaving meant freedom. It also meant loneliness. Richard knocked softly on her door. For the first time, his voice held no command. "You're really going," he said, as though saying it might change her mind. Clara didn't turn. "I have to," she answered. "This house doesn't breathe right, not for me." He stepped inside, his presence filling the room with guilt. "You don't have to go. You belong here now." She smiled sadly. "That's just it. I never did." Downstairs, Eliza folded linens with trembling hands. She'd heard Clara was leaving, but couldn't bring herself to face it. When Clara finally appeared, dressed simply, the other servants pretended to busy themselves. None spoke. Shame hung in the air like dust. Eliza rushed forward, wrapping her arms around her. "You don't owe anyone here another tear," she whispered. Clara held her tighter. "Then let this be the last one." Mr. Graves stood in the doorway, pale and unshaven. He looked smaller somehow, a man deflated by truth. "Miss Clara," he said quietly, bowing his head. "Before you go," he held out an envelope sealed with wax. "Something your mother wrote, before all this." Clara hesitated, then took it. "Why give it to me now?" He met her eyes with what little courage he had left. "Because it's the only thing I have left to give." Sometimes leaving isn't about running away. It's about walking toward who you're supposed to be. Tell me in the comments, have you ever had to let go of something that once felt like home, just to save yourself? And if you're feeling this moment with Clara, subscribe now. The carriage waited at the edge of the drive, its wheels already damp from the morning rain. Richard followed her down the steps, each one heavier than the last. "If you need anything," he began, but she cut him off gently. "I need peace, Father. That's all." He nodded, though his eyes begged her to stay. There were no grand speeches, no last-minute revelations, just a man watching his second chance drive away. As the carriage door closed, Clara caught her reflection in the window. She barely recognized the woman looking back. The servant was gone. The daughter remained, but not as she once was. The horses started forward, the mansion shrinking behind her, its white walls fading into the fog. It wasn't just distance she felt. It was release. Inside, Richard returned to the empty hall, the echo of her footsteps still fresh. He ran a hand along the staircase, as if touching the path she'd taken could bring her back. Eliza stood quietly behind him. "You did what you could," she said. "No," he replied. "I did what was easy." His voice cracked, softer than guilt, sharper than grief. On the road, the rain began to fall harder, the rhythm steady against the roof of the carriage. Clara pulled the envelope from her pocket, tracing the wax seal with her thumb, but not breaking it. Her heart knew that what was inside would change her again. She leaned her head against the window, watching the grey blur of trees. "I'll open it," she whispered, "when I'm far enough not to fall apart." Behind her, the mansion grew smaller until it disappeared. Ahead of her, the road curved into mist and promise. Freedom didn't feel like joy. It felt like ache and air mixed together. She didn't know where she was going, only that she couldn't go back. And somewhere deep in her chest, under all the pain, a small spark of peace began to flicker. Quiet, steady, alive. The road stretched endlessly ahead, grey and wet, the world hushed beneath a curtain of rain. Inside the carriage, Clara turned the envelope in her hands again and again, her mother's wax seal catching the faint light. It felt heavier than paper should, like it carried not words, but ghosts. She hesitated, heart pounding, afraid that opening it would end what little she still didn't know. But some silences begged to be broken. Her fingers trembled as she broke the seal. The scent of old ink and rosewater filled the small cabin, like a memory returning home. The letter began simply, "My dearest Clara," and already her breath caught. The handwriting was soft, looping, careful. "If you are reading this," it said, "then my greatest sin has found its way back to you. Forgive me, my love, for the distance I built to keep you safe. I thought hiding you was love. I was wrong." Clara read on, each line heavier than the last. Her mother confessed that she'd been trapped by society, by shame, by a husband's pride, and a secret lover's loyalty. "I wanted you to grow without the burden of my mistakes," she wrote. "But I see now that we don't protect the people we love by hiding them. We protect them by standing beside them." The words blurred as Clara's tears fell onto the page, smudging the ink into rivers of memory. Outside, thunder rolled over the hills. The horses slowed as the driver sought cover beneath a grove of trees. Clara pressed the letter to her chest, sobbing softly. "You loved me," she whispered, her voice breaking in half. The truth didn't hurt. It healed in a way pain never could. It filled the hollow space left by every lie, every silence. "You loved me," she repeated, like a prayer answered too late. She read the last line again, whispering it aloud. "Tell him she has his eyes." The carriage seemed to hold its breath. Richard's eyes. Her mother's voice echoed between every heartbeat. Clara realized then that her mother hadn't written a confession. She'd written a bridge between what was broken and what might still be mended, between the past and whatever waited for her now. When the rain eased, she asked the driver to turn back. "Home," she said simply. He looked surprised, but didn't question her. The wheels splashed through puddles, carrying her not toward the mansion, but toward the truth she was finally ready to face. In her lap, the letter fluttered slightly in the breeze, as though her mother's hand still guided her from beyond. Hours later, the first glimpse of the estate appeared through the mist. The gates stood open, their iron vines slick with rain. Clara's pulse quickened, fear and resolve braided tight inside her chest. She tucked the letter safely into her coat. It wasn't just a note, it was a map of love's mistakes and redemption. And she was following it home. Back at the mansion, the sky had begun to clear, golden light spilling through the clouds. Smoke no longer rose from its chimneys, only silence did. Clara stepped out of the carriage and breathed deeply. The earth smelled new. She looked up at the windows where her life had been broken and rebuilt and whispered, "I forgive you." The wind carried her words away, but somehow she felt they had landed where they were meant to. For the first time, she wasn't running from the past or fighting it. She was walking beside it. The letter's edges were soft now, damp from her tears and the rain. She smiled faintly through the ache. Love, she realized, wasn't meant to erase pain. It was meant to survive it. And with that, Clara crossed the threshold once more, ready to face the ghosts as a daughter, not a servant. The road back to the mansion felt different this time. The same trees that once looked like walls now seemed like witnesses. The gravel crunched beneath the carriage wheels, echoing like footsteps from another life. Clara held her mother's letter close to her heart, its words still pulsing inside her chest. For the first time, she wasn't afraid of arriving. She was afraid of not being understood. When the gates opened, the house stood quiet, stripped of its former arrogance. No guests, no laughter, no masks, just stillness, honest and raw. Clara stepped down, her boots sinking into the damp earth. Richard appeared at the top of the older somehow, his eyes tired but searching. For a moment neither spoke. The silence between them wasn't cold anymore. It was waiting. He descended slowly as if afraid she might vanish if he moved too quickly. "You came back," he said, his voice cracking on the second word. "I read the letter," she replied softly. "She wanted you to know. She never stopped loving either of us." Richard's gaze fell to the envelope in her hand, trembling slightly. "I thought I'd lost both of you forever," he murmured. "But maybe grief was just love without direction." They entered the hall together. Dust floated in the air, turning the sunlight into gold. Every corner of the house felt gentler now, less like a prison and more like a memory learning to forgive itself. Clara paused in front of the staircase where everything had begun. The glass, the humiliation, the revelation. "It feels smaller," she said quietly. Richard smiled faintly. "Maybe we finally grew bigger." Sometimes forgiveness doesn't come in words. It arrives in the quiet spaces where pain used to live. If you've ever made peace with someone after years of distance, share it in the comments. Your story might help someone take that same first step. And if you're walking this path with Clara, subscribe now. The end is near, but it's the kind of ending that begins again. Richard led her into the library. The shelves were blackened from the fire, but the air was calm. "I kept this," he said, holding out a small frame, the half-burned photograph. The baby's face, untouched by flame, stared back at her. Clara brushed her thumb over the image. "She kept us both alive," she whispered. He nodded. "She always did." For the first time, they shared a smile that didn't hide pain behind it. They sat together in silence, the crackle of the fireplace the only sound between them. "I never knew how to be your father," he said finally. "I only knew how to protect a reputation." Clara looked at him gently. "Then start by protecting something real." Her voice didn't shake this time. He nodded slowly, as though she had just told him something sacred. "I will," he promised. "I swear it." Evening light spilled through the windows, painting their faces in amber. The ghosts of the past didn't leave. They simply learned to sit quietly in the corners. Clara rested her hand on the arm of the chair, and Richard placed his over hers. No grand gestures. No speeches, just two broken hearts learning how to beat in rhythm again. The silence between them became a kind of prayer. Later, Clara wandered into the gallery where her mother's portrait still hung. The painting had survived the fire, its colours softened but intact. She stood before it, feeling both small and infinite. "We're home now," she whispered. The painted eyes seemed warmer somehow, the faintest hint of a smile returning to their corners. It was as if forgiveness had brushed new life into the canvas. Outside, the rain had stopped completely. The night air was cool, carrying the scent of wet soil and renewal. Clara stood by the open window, watching the first stars blink awake. Behind her, her father's voice was soft but steady. "You remind me of her," he said. "No," Clara replied, turning toward him. "I remind you of us." And in that moment, for the first time in their lives, days passed, and the mansion began to breathe differently. The walls no longer whispered in fear, but in memory. Clara spent her mornings in the garden, tending to flowers that had survived neglect. Each petal felt like a small miracle, proof that beauty could bloom again after ruin. But one shadow still lingered in her thoughts: Mr. Graves. She hadn't seen him since the night of his dismissal, yet guilt had a way of keeping his name alive. One morning Eliza came running with a letter in her hand. "It's from the hospice," she said softly. "Mr. Graves is very ill. He's asked for you." Clara froze. The name hit her chest like an echo of every scar she'd tried to bury. "Does he have family?" she asked. Eliza shook her head. "Only regret." For a moment Clara hesitated, but then she folded the letter and whispered, "Then I'll go." The hospice sat on the edge of town, small and quiet, surrounded by pale fields and wind. Inside, the air smelled of antiseptic and faded time. A nurse led her down the corridor. "He doesn't have long," she said gently. Clara nodded, her palms clammy, her heart steady. The door creaked open, revealing a man half the size of the one she'd known, thin, grey and trembling. When he turned his head and saw her, his eyes filled instantly with tears. "Miss Clara," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper. "You came." She stepped closer, unsure whether she was visiting an enemy or a ghost. "I almost didn't," she admitted, "but I didn't want your last breath to be silence." He gave a fragile laugh that turned into a cough. "Silence is all I deserve." She sat beside him, the distance between their chairs feeling heavier than years of lies. Graves reached out, his hand shaking. Clara hesitated, then took it. "I failed her," he said, his voice weak but clear. "Your mother. I betrayed her love, and in trying to make it right, I betrayed you too." She didn't answer right away. Her fingers tightened gently around his. "She forgave you," she said. "I know she did." He looked at her with disbelief. "How could you know that?" "Because she taught me how." Tears spilled freely down his cheeks. "You are your mother's mercy," he whispered, "and his conscience." Clara smiled faintly through the ache. "And your redemption." He closed his eyes, the faintest smile tracing his lips. "Then I can rest," he said softly. The air in the room shifted. The weight
Lighter,
he'd carried for
cleaner.
decades seemed to lift as his breathing slowed. Clara sat there long after the nurse had covered him with a white sheet. The silence wasn't cruel anymore. It was sacred. She touched the cross at the end of his bed and whispered, "You made her cry once, but now she can rest too." Outside, the wind moved through the fields, carrying away the last remnants of a man who had finally stopped running from himself. On the way back, the world looked different, softer somehow. Clara didn't feel the same kind of grief she expected. It wasn't bitterness or relief, it was closure. In his death, Mr. Graves had given her something he couldn't give in life: peace. She looked up at the sky, where clouds drifted like pages turning in a story that had finally found its ending. When she reached the mansion gates, Richard was waiting for her. She didn't need to speak. The look in her eyes said everything. "He's gone," she said quietly. "Then let him rest," Richard replied. She nodded, and for a moment they both stood still, watching the evening settle over the estate. "We all served the same house," Clara murmured, "but now it's time to serve something greater." Her father smiled. "And what's that?" She looked toward the horizon. "Peace." Spring came quietly, wrapping the estate in soft gold and new beginnings. The mansion no longer looked like a monument to pride, but like a house rediscovering its soul. Laughter returned to its halls, not the cruel kind that used to echo during parties, but gentle, honest laughter. Clara walked through the corridors in a white dress that brushed lightly against the walls, as if blessing them. The house, for the first time, felt alive. Where once there had been servants scurrying in fear, there were now women with purpose. Clara had turned part of the mansion into a refuge for those who, like her, had once been unseen. The air was filled with the scent of bread and lavender soap, with footsteps that no longer crept but danced. Richard watched from the staircase, his cane in hand, pride softening his face. "Your mother would have been proud," he said. Clara smiled. "She already is." In the great hall, sunlight streamed through tall windows, turning dust into glitter. The marble floor, once stained with tears and broken glass, now reflected warmth. Clara hung a small portrait of her mother beside the staircase, its frame simple but radiant. "She belongs here," she whispered. Richard nodded. "And so do you." The words felt like a full circle closing with grace instead of shame. Sometimes the end of a story isn't about revenge or justice. It's about finally choosing peace. If this story moves something inside you, tell me in the comments what forgiveness means to you. And if you've walked this journey with Clara until... Now subscribe, because stories like this one remind us that broken doesn't mean finished. It means ready to begin again. Outside, a group of women worked in the garden, laughter weaving between them like music. Clara joined them, kneeling in the soil, her fingers pressing life back into the earth. "It's strange," one of them said, smiling, "to see a lady work beside us." Clara laughed softly. "I used to clean these floors," she replied. "Now I'm just cleaning the past." The woman nodded, tears in her eyes. "Then you've done something holy." As the day stretched toward evening, Richard walked slowly through the halls, touching the walls, as if reacquainting himself with the home he'd nearly lost. He paused before the gallery where the portraits hung. The faces of generations seemed less judgmental now, less proud, more human. "We carried our sins too long," he whispered. "It's time this house carried hope instead." When the first stars began to appear, Clara lit candles throughout the hall. Their glow danced along the walls, soft and golden. The mansion no longer felt haunted. It felt grateful. She sat at the piano, fingers hovering over the keys. She didn't play for the guests or for appearances. She played for her mother, for the girl who cried, and for the woman who had learned to forgive. Eliza entered quietly, holding a tray of tea. "You've built something beautiful," she said. "Not just the house, the people too." Clara smiled, her eyes reflecting the candlelight. "Beauty isn't what we inherit," she said. "It's what we rebuild." They sat together in silence, the kind that felt like a heartbeat shared by two souls who had survived everything and were still kind. Later, Clara walked through the garden one last time before sleep. The night smelled of jasmine and rain. Fireflies hovered in the air like tiny spirits keeping watch. She stopped by the pond, where the moon mirrored perfectly on the surface. "We're all forgiven now," she whispered, her voice carrying softly across the water. The reflection shimmered, as if answering her prayer. At dawn, the house filled with light. The walls gleamed, the air hummed, and the world outside seemed to exhale. Clara stood by the staircase, her mother's portrait glowing in the morning sun. "No more tears," she said softly, smiling through her own. And for the first time since her story began, the mansion didn't echo back sorrow. It answered with silence, warm and complete, the sound of peace finally finding its home. If Clara's journey touched your heart, tell me in the comments, what does forgiveness mean to you? And if you believe, like I do, that stories like this can heal something inside us, subscribe, leave a like, and stay close. Because somewhere out there, another story is waiting to be told. And maybe it's yours.